are living in a computer-programmed reality, and the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed and some alteration in our reality occurs. We would have the overwhelming impression that we were reliving the present, déjà vu, perhaps in precisely the same way, hearing the same words, saying the same words. I submit that these impressions are valid and significant, and I will even say this: such an impression is a clue that at some past time point a variable was changed, reprogrammed as it were, and that because of this an alternative world branched off.
Of course, that was the great James Marshall Hendricks blasting out an anthem for the times all along the Watchtower, and an anthem for the ages in many ways. And a lot of us have been all along the Watchtower nearly all of our lives. And one man in particular that we're going to bring on here in just a moment, Perry Ulander. The song is very fitting because it comes from an era where there is intense strife, discord, contention, vituperation, you name it. And of course, I'm talking about the period at the height of the Vietnam War, roughly around 1966, around 1971, very heavy duty time for the United States and the world at large. And Perry was there firsthand and made it through, and not only made it through, but the conflict and the experience became a catalyst for change and transcendence and a launching pad into a deeply spiritual life. And there's a really interesting story about the book. I'm going to just tell you the story briefly, and then I want to read John Rappaport's addition to what Perry wrote here. It's great. And most people who listen to this show know that John Rappaport is a top-shelf mind, a great investigator, lucid, clear, and able to put things into context in a way that is really definable and at times really even incredibly poetic. So let me just tell you the story about how Perry came into my life, why we're talking today. I'm going to read the Rappaport tidbit, and then we'll bring Perry on. We'll talk about him, his journey, his evolutionary path through the war, and how it's impacted his life now. It's a great, great story. So Perry came to me, and I was going through the sort of the texts that we had shot back and forth with one another, and the original manuscript that he sent to me, and it was, I believe, in January of 2015. It was January 17th, 2015. And Perry was a client. He, found the show and found the website, and maybe through Guy, I'm not sure, but I saw the manuscript and I went through it, and I didn't have to read very far. And I knew that this was something that my friend Richard Grossinger, who's been on the show on a number of occasions and is the kahuna, he's retired, but he's still the kahuna at North Atlantic Press. And I know that Richard has an amazing soft spot in his heart for people that go through the quote-unquote everyday trials and tribulations rituals and emancipations of daily life and transform themselves into spiritualized beings. And I also know that Richard also has a real fondness for the 60s and particularly items and people and experiences around the Vietnam War. So I thought that this was going to be an absolute slam dunk. And when I sent it to Richard, it took him about 2 days to get back to me. And he said, Robert, this is amazing. I think we have a book here. Let me pass it on to the staff at North Atlantic. And then that was it. The rest was history. And this book, which had been a long time in the making, we'll talk about that process as well, which is fascinating, given the amount of dialogue that Perry has in the book and the detail of the dialogue. It's incredible. It was a long time in the making, and it's come to light. It came out this, I believe it was the 17th of May, if I'm not mistaken. And it's out there now. Walking Point from the Ashes of the Vietnam War, a memoir, Perry A. Ulander. So let me read you the Rappaport intro here, and then I'm going to bring Perry on right after I read this. It says here, the voyage of a soldier in war should have been revealed 10,000 years ago. It turns the world upside down. In the same moment, it nails you to the wall and liberates you. Impossible, but it happens. The last 3 pages alone are a testament and a revelation that should somehow be made visible everywhere soldiers gather, so they know that someone else knows what coming home really means. The author launches a stroke of lightning above the hidden human psyche, from the days of ancient caves to the days of modern cities. 10,000 years ago, perhaps it would have been sent human history. 10,000 years ago, perhaps it would have sent human history down a different path. That's high praise from John Rappaport. High praise. Perry, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Robert. I'm glad to be here. Appreciate the opportunity.
So I was just sharing with people how we connected in this whole process, which I think is pretty true to the process itself. Is there anything you want to add to that?
One minor modification to the show notes, and I think you kind of covered it in your description, is that in the show notes it says after a lifetime of reflection, and actually it was during a lifetime of reflection. And the editors at North Atlantic Books actually made that change on the book, but it didn't come out on the internet here.
Okay.
Because actually I started it in 1978, taking notes on what I could remember, and then revisited again in 88, and then in 96, and pretty much finished it then, and then put it away and thought, oh, well, And it wasn't until I got that reading with you, and I asked what you thought about the possibility of it being published, that I actually considered bringing it out of the drawer.
Well, I saw it in your chart with your ninth house and the amalgam of planets in Sagittarius, and I just thought, hey, Saturn's coming up in Sagittarius, this is your time, and lo and behold, here it is, Saturn, Sagittarius, Saturn being the hard work, Sagittarius really publishing, and we're having this conversation now.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing. That reading, I re-listened to that about maybe a week ago, and I was blown over. The one that you did, about a year and a half ago?
Yeah. And
it was right on. It was right on. It was eerie.
Do you know John Rappaport? Is he a friend of yours?
No. I've heard him on the internet, and I really, really like his stuff. I mean, he's clear-minded. He's strong. He goes where others, dare not go. I mean, even the Zika virus thing he did recently. Yeah. I mean, he's stepping on some toes with that stuff. But he's clear. He's got the goods. He's got the documented information. He's done the research. And just that element of his interaction with the general, internet viewing or listening audience relieved a lot of people from stressing out hugely, I hope. Because
around Zika?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He said basically it's been around since 1947.
That's right.
And that statistics have shown that most of the microencephalitis is from the chemicals sprayed to eradicate the mosquitoes rather than the mosquitoes.
That's right. Absolutely. Yeah. And what they're doing, they're going to be bringing in their genetically modified mosquitoes now.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
Who knows what they're going to bring with them to combat Zika. We're getting all the Zika public service announcements here in Texas, and because of the rain, I've never seen so many damn mosquitoes now. So who knows what they're cooking up and getting ready to unleash from Pandora's box.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do you feel about that sentence? I just want to read that sentence again. 10,000 years ago, perhaps it would have sent human history down a different path. That's kind of an amazing sentence.
Yeah, the thing is, he started out with that quote with he said, "I'm going to say something strange," and I think he meant that people would take it as strange. But when I reflected on that quote, what I thought was, throughout history, basically the reality of war is silenced in two specific ways. One is to make the warrior a hero, and the other one is to make him a scapegoat.
Mm-hmm.
Either way, they're stunned. And, like, say, the World War II guys come back and ticker tape parades and all of this stuff. And it doesn't create an atmosphere where they can really share that this was pretty insane, And I'd had no qualm with the individual people that I might have killed. And now they're not our enemies anymore. And how bizarre is that?
How bizarre is we've just decided that we're going to sell them weapons again.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And then the thing was with Vietnam, it was like the geopolitical atmosphere of the war and the amount of negotiation and or politicking that could have gone on to not have the war or even minimize the impact of the war, get out earlier, which were there several opportunities, was a total failure. So to deflect the public anger and frustration, I think the vets were set up to be the scapegoat for that. And so then there you are, you've already been diminished in the eyes of the general public as a loser and a lunatic. And you come home and you realize that you can't say anything about what your experience was. Even though I think the whole thing with most of the guys that went there should have been integrated into the national psyche as a learning experience, but that option was skillfully blocked.
There were no Audie Murphys.
Yeah.
In the Vietnam War.
Right. And the thing is that we learned that it was insane. I think most people who were in Vietnam learned that it was absolutely crazy and didn't make any sense. It didn't make any sense foreign policy-wise. It didn't make any sense strategy or tactics-wise. Was just crazy. And so there we were, and basically we had to just fight our way out till we got home.
Yeah. It's really interesting, Perry, when I think of the sort of archetypal American hero from the Vietnam War, it's John McCain. And his heroic status, whether it's real or not, is Hotel Hanoi, and he actually is a victim in a lot of ways. So we're celebrating like martyrdom and victimhood, if that's even really the true story. That's our model for the hero from Vietnam.
Yeah, and in the run-up to the Iraq War, I don't know how far they had to scan to find these guys, but they found some Vietnam vets that were still, let's go into Iraq and protect freedom and democracy. And when they would drag these guys out in the media, I was just aghast, going, where did they get this guy? I don't think he speaks for 99% of the Vietnam vets.
Yeah. The whole run-up of the Iraq War, all those people that were these military advisors, and, they're all, like, just bleeding red, white, and blue all over your screen on Fox. All those guys were hired. They're all hired guns. They're all getting paid for their advocacy. So I'm sure if they've reached back far enough and found a few of these guys that, they're probably in the same payroll. I just want to wander off the Ho Chi Minh Trail a little bit here for a second in terms of content, but this has to do with strategy and some of the things that people have talked about. Why were we there? And one of the prevalent underlying themes was the heroin trade and sort of taking that over from the French. What's your thought on that? And did you directly or indirectly ever run into those kinds of operations while you were there?
No. The thing is that what I've heard, basically the bottom line is I know what I know and I don't know what I don't know. And I don't know anything about the heroin trade, although I'd heard of that, and it makes sense. But for me to go any farther than that, I saw no specific evidence when I was over there.
Yeah.
Although I did know heroin popped up late in my tour, and it was available at the villages, and some guys were getting hooked on it, and that kind of raised some kind of question marks.
Was that around 69, 70, right around then?
Yeah. And they were the Vietnamese villagers were selling it as cocaine, and I think cocaine was beginning to become popular in the States at the time and considered harmless in contrast to what actually heroin does.
So we're getting, at the very least, guys were getting hooked in Nam and coming home.
Oh yeah, for sure. Not in large numbers. In the group I was with, it was tolerated, but it wasn't really advocated because the stuff was like 99% pure, and the addiction happened really quickly, and then you have a problem because it's a whole different thing from smoking marijuana.
Oh, it's like dropping down into the bowels of Hades. First of all, you get really high and you're up in Asgard, right? But then you got to drop down pretty far, and you're in the clutches of it. I just want to ask you about two historical figures before we talk about you, where you came from, the evolutionary path, and your life in the book. Two very polarizing figures from that time, Henry Kissinger and Robert McNamara. For those people that don't know or aren't familiar, McNamara was the Secretary of Defense, who was the architect in many ways of the war here in the States. And there's a great documentary with Errol Morris with him called The Fog of War, which I highly recommend. And then Henry Kissinger was the lead dog and in the Paris peace talks. What are your thoughts around these two guys? Because they're big figures for that time.
I think I hadn't delved into the politics of the war to that degree that I could really make an intelligent comment on those guys. Yeah. I thought they were incredibly suspicious and didn't have the best interests of the country at heart. But I thought in a reflection of and an accurate description of foreign policy, I think Daniel Ellsberg's work was probably the most viable, and from my perspective. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because once he got into the Pentagon Papers, he knew that we basically had lost the war, like in '67 or so, and the rest of it was just throwing good money and good lives after bad. Right.
And the bottom line is that when you deal with the rules of engagement, you're really dealing with a non-winnable war in a lot of ways. And
exactly.
That's what you guys were involved with. Again, before we get into this, I think it's so fascinating. Here we are. It's Mars retrograde. We're talking about you. We're talking about your book. Obama goes to Hiroshima, retrograde, going back in time. Pluto, right, the ruler of Scorpio, plutonium, the bomb, and he's actually reconnecting with South Vietnam in general now, and selling them weapons. I mean, here's Mars retrograde, right out in front, and sort of taking us backwards in time with all this stuff. So it's just a really interesting note astrologically. What's going on in your past, in your retrograde? Tell us a little bit about where you came from, what your pre-Vietnam life was like, and then let's get into the book and your experience there.
Okay. I would say that my early years up through high school and a couple years of college were probably cookie cutter 1950s kid, right? I mean, it was house in the suburbs. My dad was an engineer. I had an older brother and a younger sister. And it was Walt Disney once a week, occasional TV dinner, Saturday morning cartoons, In the morning, we were across from the schoolyard. You'd put on your shorts and T-shirt and blast out the door and go across the street and fly a kite or go into the woods or something. And, for people my age, when we consider the freedom we had as kids and the sense of safety we had in the neighborhood, and look at what's going on now, it's really tragic. But I would say up and through high school and the first couple of years of college, it was about as normal as it could possibly be. By the time I was going to engineering school, there had been not a whole lot of demonstrations or anything going on, and so it was like life as usual, life as we've been taught it should be. And part of me was kind of questioning what's going on, but the other part, I had no frame of reference. Everything was taken at face value, and you move along with that. There was nothing to contrast it with.
Interesting. And that was, and culturally speaking, that was really the norm.
Oh,
right?
It was absolutely normal, yeah.
Wow, I can't even begin to imagine what that was like. I mean, I dropped in 1960. One of my earliest memories is watching JFK's funeral from a hospital bed after I got my tonsils taken out. And I knew on some level I was living in a different kind of world even back then.
The things changed.
They did change. They changed for you. Talk about your induction process, the draft, all that stuff.
Okay, well, the thing is that I had no idea what was going on politically. Once I got out of the home front and was going to college, my main thing was get a decent enough grades to make it to the next semester, and drink a few beers and have some fun, and explore the freedom of being out from under the thumb of the family unit. And after a couple years of college, I thought I was in architectural engineering. I thought, well, I wasn't liking the math. I made it through calculus, and then it went on, and I thought, man, this is getting over my head. So maybe if I get a job in engineering and I can see how all this math and stuff is applied, maybe it'll give me more incentive to dig into it a little deeper and take a couple more years of school. And I was 8 weeks working for Wisconsin Bridge and Iron, sizing steel beams and girders and trusses and such. And here comes the draft notice. And I was stunned. It was like out of left field. And from then on, it was like a whirlwind of events. And report here, report there, do this, do that. And pretty soon you're on a bus to Fort Polk, Louisiana. And the barber's coming in for a crash landing on your head, taking your hair off. So it was sudden and swift, and I have to admit, I was absolutely clueless. I was vaguely aware of the war, but I thought, that's got to be over by now, and they surely don't want me. And then, ignorance is bliss for a while.
That is, it's kind of, it reminds me of people that have these experiences like smoking DMT. They're in one reality and they smoke the DMT, and the next thing you know, they're in a completely different reality. And,
right.
And it takes, once they come back, they're like, what just happened? And it takes the body and the mind some time to kind of integrate and settle down and say, things have changed. The world is very different. What was that experience like for you in basic training, where they basically are there to break you and then program you into being somebody who, at the very least, will take an order without hesitation and hopefully will kill on command because that's what they need, or perhaps maybe even your life or your buddy's life depends upon it. What's going through your mind during basic?
Part of me was observing it as almost as a detached observer. And I was picking up on the fact that there was a program going on. And a couple of the things that became obvious was whoever you were before you were in the service was denigrated to the degree that it was considered absolutely worthless and of no value. And you were screamed at and told that you were whale dew, and that's at the bottom of the ocean, and you were nothing until you started to conform with the expectations and desires and programs that the military was installing in you. And years later, I had a roommate who was a psychologist, and his dad was a psychologist, and we got to talking one time, and I said, well, what did your dad do? And he said, he worked for the Department of Defense. And I said, what did he do for the Department of Defense? And he said, oh, he did propaganda. And there was a plane that used to fly over the Central Highlands with a wailing in Vietnamese, and I asked one of our Kit Carson scouts, I says, what's that? And he says, that's the wailing of the last Vietnamese soldier to be killed in the war, to kind of encourage the North Vietnamese to give up. And I said, so was that what your dad was doing? And he said, no. And I said, well, what was he doing? He said he was creating propaganda for you. And he described part of the program that was the indoctrination of going through basic training. And he had a name for the first part of it, was mortification, which was to destroy your identity. And so I'm watching, first they're keeping you up at night. The first night you get there and hollering and screaming at you, and you're sitting in bleachers under bright lights. And then you're walking in a daze through these lines where they're giving you shots in the left arm, shots in the right arm. Then you get your hair cut. Then you go to this other building. It's a model of efficiency. And you're handed a stack of fatigues and a pair of boots, and on it goes. And it was amazing, and I picked up on elements of it and saw that I was supposed to conform to a whole different mindset and value system. Mm-hmm. And what amazed me was I saw people that did that, and I couldn't believe it. And yet I didn't have the wherewithal, the perspective, or probably intelligence to understand it completely enough to say, the next time I go on leave, I'm heading for Canada.
Yeah.
Because they don't care if you pick up on 80% of it, so long as you're still stumbling along with the mob.
Right.
And that's where I was.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, the process that you're talking about in having people, kind of shift and warp into the program or the propaganda is not just a part of that basic training experience or boot camp. It's a part of life. I mean, that model is everywhere, and it's getting more prevalent, by the way.
Yeah, and as is with the military, the consequences for nonconformity are getting a little bit more drastic as the economy gets a little tighter.
That's right.
So.
That's right. Talk about some of the guys that you went through basic with, and then, boots on the ground in Nam. Why don't you give people kind of a sample and cross-section of who they were, where they came from, what some of their stories were?
It was a whiz-bang thing through basic and AIT. It's like 8 weeks, and basically your head is swimming. Each one, basic is 8 weeks, and AIT is 8 weeks. And so you don't have a lot of free time to shuck and jive and compare notes. But I did have a couple characters that I went on leave with and would communicate with when we were in the barracks. And one guy was from Wisconsin. I really can't remember his name. But at any rate, he was kind of a goofball, and we enjoyed trying to extract some humor out of the situation. And, for example, we would be on a training mission, and we would be manning these bunkers. And supposedly then there would be the B team would come and attack us in the middle of the night or try to infiltrate our position and so forth and so on. And we were supposed to be up and ready to start firing blanks and such. And he would say, for every command, there's a preparatory command and a command of execution. Ready, sleep. And we'd crash out, and the guys that come and they'd overrun our position. We go, oh, well, But there were people that didn't take it all that seriously. But then we were there, you know.
Right. So what about when you arrive in Nam and you get assigned to your unit? What about some of these characters now that are part of your life, become part of the book, or in real important fabric with your story? Maybe you can give people kind of a sense as to who they are and sort of their backgrounds and how you merged with some and perhaps not so with some others. Because when you and I were talking, you're basically saying that there are kind of two types that were over Nam. There were the lifers, who were the hoorah, and then there were, guys like yourself who were just trying to get through any way possible.
Yeah, the first time I ran into the platoon that I was going to be assigned to, it was Christmas of 1970, and I had been in country for a couple of weeks. You go through some jungle school training, and then you get shipped up to LZ Uplift, is where my base camp was. And the company that I was assigned to had been out in the field, and I was waiting for them to come in for stand down for a few days, and then I was going to go out in the field with them. And I was in the mess hall, and these guys offloaded on these helicopters, and they came in, and they were the most horrifying sight I'd ever seen. They were out of uniform. Their boots were all scraggly. They were wearing sweatbands and FTA on their helmets, which means F the Army. And their eyes were like 100-year-old men. I mean, it was like all of a sudden they were 18, 19, 20, and they knew more than you're supposed to know at that age. Mm-hmm. And I thought, and I'm going to become one of these? And kind of a chill went down my spine, because the transition from the relative innocence that I was experiencing at that moment to what I could tell from looking in these guys' eyes was a huge leap. And I sensed that ultimately I was going to be making that leap sooner or later.
Yeah.
So the first couple nights on bunker guard, one particular guy named Tennessee, he took me under his wing, as did a lot of the guys in whatever they had to offer individually. Some of them were good at field tactics. Some of them were good at sensing that emotionally you were wobbling. Others were just like really, really good friends. And so I met Tennessee. I met Captain Speed, who's, of course, not his name. And they tried as best they could to give me a kind of a crash course on what to do in the field and what was going on. And at that time, when these guys came in from the field, the point element had run into a booby trap. And the first guy was killed, the second guy got his leg blown off, and the third guy got peppered with shrapnel from head to toe.
Right.
And they weren't at all thrilled about that, because they said that the point element had detected a sign that the trail would booby trapped. But the man in command needed to get from point A to point B, according to the guys that were in the bunker in the rear, putting pins on a map. And so there was an argument between the point element and the platoon leader. And finally, the platoon leader pulled rank and said, "We'll go down the trail anyway, but be careful." And you can't see a booby trap. It could be a rock that wiggles, a branch that's attached to some kind of tripwire. It's invisible, basically.
Right.
So even though the guy knew that there was going to be likely a booby trap down the trail, he had to follow orders, and it didn't work out well. So on top of everything else, there was this huge amount of rage. And I was stunned. I was absolutely stunned. And all of it it did not compute. It was an overload of information and emotions.
So you're going from one level of shock, which is the draft notice, to another level of shock, which is induction process and boot camp and that whole 16-week period to another level of shock. Being in really Vietnam was like a foreign planet. Really, I mean, let's cut to the chase on this thing. Unlike, I mean, you know, maybe really in the very northern part of, you know, Wisconsin, you know, up there in the Dales or whatever, where it's real thick and vegetal, but nothing like Vietnam in terms of vegetation, heat, humidity, creatures. You're on another planet, so now you've got that shock. And then you've got the shock of the initial burst of combat, if that's what you want to call it, but also tragedy and error, a human error. And I mean, it's all starting to stack up now, isn't it?
Yeah, and be incredibly overwhelming. You just can't compute. So you just take a breath and you put one foot in front of the other and hope for the best.
Yeah.
But I did right off the bat learn to trust the guys, and I was amazed that they would extend themselves to me. And I think at first I was kind of suspicious. I thought, well, what's going on here? Because that's generally not the pattern that you would expect if you were in a new job in some corporation, right?
Right.
But basically, partly it was survival of the group kind of thing to get everybody up to speed, and I think partly it was they realized who they were, and they, you know, whatever kind of form it was expressed, they were in touch with their humanity and their compassion. Right. So it came out in different ways, but that was the motivating force for their behavior.
Now, from what I understand, you can correct me if I'm wrong, there are really two schools of thought around the new guy, you know, coming into Nam. One was that experience where it's like, hey, the group really depends on having this guy being a real functional member. And, you know, my life, in a lot of ways, depends on his life and vice versa. So you got to get him up to speed. The other school of thought was, you know, they don't want to get attached to you, especially early on, because you may not make it. And then you would have to get to a certain point before they would attach themselves to you and then invest in you. So did you find that there were these two sort of, you know, realities that were running parallel right at that time?
I'd heard of that, but the former was my experience.
Yeah.
And what I'd heard about, basically, that was more in line with the other option was this sense that, oh, here's a new guy. He's going to be basically a detriment and something that we have to kind of drag along and bring up to speed at the expense of our time and attention. And so there was, you know, in some people I've talked to said that there was a certain amount of resentment when you came in as a new guy, that it was, oh boy, another training session, you know. But there were guys in my platoon, one Tennessee who walked point, stayed at point. He wasn't about to train anybody because he had switched with the guy who was carrying the radio. The radio man said, "Hey, God, take over on this radio. The pack is too heavy." And so that guy walked point, and then he got blown away. So Tennessee, for one thing, he understood that he was up to speed with that position, and also he had survival guilt. So, and Captain Speed, who walked point quite a bit, also realized that there could be nobody that would step into his level of expertise at that position.
Talk a little bit about nicknames. We have Tennessee, Doc Mock, Captain Speed, your Babe.
Yeah.
So, you know, we watched the Vietnam films, and the nicknames are, you know, part of the vernacular. Maybe talk a little bit about the context of the nickname, the alter ego, why it's chosen, how it's chosen, psychological effect. Do you become that character? Is that character extracted from within you? This whole notion of identity with the alter ego, with the nickname in a situation like that?
I think the thing arose, I've kind of pondered this, is that you're in such a dramatically different venue from where you came that you absolutely need to step into a different persona of sorts, and not necessarily the one that was imprinted by the military, but just a different role, which, from my experience, was to be more of who you really were rather than to be a function of the conditioning and programming. So it seemed appropriate to me that everybody had a different name from their given name, because they weren't the previous individual. You weren't dragging your, like as the military did in the mortification process, you weren't bringing your back home identity into this scene, and you weren't bringing your programmed military identity into this scene. You were something else. Mm-hmm. And that something else basically required a new name. And so mine was, what the kids used to tease me when I was real young. I was the youngest in the family, and they used to call me Baby. So they said, well, what are you going to call him? Who are you? And I said, I'm Babe, I guess. But some of the guys, we had a guy that was a little bit older, and he was kind of almost from the beatnik generation, and so we called him Bootnik. Bootnik. And he's still around and a great guy. And, Captain Speed was Captain Speed. And Doc Mock was actually, his last name is Mock. But we all the medics were called Doc because they were as close as we ever got, and sometimes better than, the field surgeons and stuff were absolutely excellent, but they were as good as a doctor as we had in the field. And just to note, those pictures that you have on your site, that one of on the right-hand side of a guy in a beret and a black T-shirt giving the Black Power thing, that's Doc Mock. And
Doc Black Power, that's an awesome picture.
Yeah, and he was truly an inspiration. He was one of these guys that can tiptoe through hell and walk on fire and laugh and have fun. Wow. And I always marveled at his ability to do that. And as you can see, he was absolutely, even from that picture, you can see he was unafraid and unconcerned about getting busted.
Oh, yeah.
So
this is great. He's wearing like the Beretta-style cap and shades, and he's got the Black Power symbol, and he's got this. Yeah. This was an M16. Is that what he's toting?
Yeah, that's an M16. Yeah.
And he's got a big spliffer in his mouth. And
and the one down in the bottom right-hand corner is a guy lighting what we call bong song bombers with another one, and they were huge. They were monstrous, as you can see.
Totally monstrous. The whole notion of fighting in a state like that just blows my mind, because my experiences with cannabis are varied. When I was very young, it was very enjoyable. When I was not so young, it became far less enjoyable. And as I got older and as it began to change, it became almost hellish for me. I couldn't even begin to wrap my head around getting high and going on a mission. What was that like for you psychologically? Was that really just a survival tool to help you kind of deal with the stress and the trauma of what was going on? How did it help you in terms of your reflexes, or what was that like?
The thing is, actually, when we were on the move, there wasn't much of an opportunity to smoke, but sometimes when we would logger in on a hilltop or even in the dense jungle, we had an opportunity. And what I sensed from it was that the old-timers who'd been there maybe a year had a way of coping. They had shifted psychologically into a different space of total immersion into the environment and into the moment. And that's what that transition was necessary for the newer guys. And so from my experience, when the first night I was on guard and Speed slips up behind me and shares a joint with me, it kind of balanced out the overly yang energy of somebody that's 19 and 20, and then opens up your perceptual spectrum to a wider sense of sound and smell and and experience. So to me, it was one of these things where generally I think Americans are really yang, really active, really go-getter, and we were in a situation where we were fighting with an adversary that had an anciently evolved a skill set that had evolved from ancient times insofar as both martial arts and tactics and warfare. Mm-hmm. And part of their skill set was to be very sensitive and very, very aware of the moment and very patient insofar as timing was concerned. So from my sense of things, it helped us settle down and become a little bit more receptive to the environment than in contrast to just plowing through down the trail thinking that we had sophisticated and superior weaponry and firepower and we're going to do the Arnold Schwarzenegger thing and beat them up by brute force. We needed to resonate more with the mindset of our adversary.
Yeah. So your feeling was that perhaps that allowed you to drop in to the landscape a little bit more and get more grounded in their reality?
Yeah, exactly. And it was a catalyst for change because when I first met the guys, they were operating from a whole different space than what I had been trained and accustomed and socialized into experiencing as a person. So I think there might have been a degree of placebo effect with it too, mm-hmm. where what you might have considered previously impossible was now possible. Mm-hmm. And so I think on some level it had a therapeutic effect, actually.
We're talking with Perry Ulander, the author of Walking Point from the Ashes of the Vietnam War. And it is a brand new book that is published by North Atlantic Books, and you can find it on the Random House Penguin page, pretty prestigious distributor, and also Amazon, where there are a number of reviews. Some are incredibly positive and understand what Perry's talking about, and other reviews that you and I have spoken about where there still tends to be this, how do I say this? I wouldn't call it romanticized, but it's rooted in this kind of no questions asked style of patriotism that some of these reviews have come in on, and basically knocking your book as, in your experience, as somebody who's just smoking dope through the war, which could be, it couldn't be further from the truth. And it still astounds me to this day that this point of view around the heroic efforts of the Vietnam War and the soldier that was there, fighting the good fight, standing up for the American ideals, that somehow that they were more morally sound and unassailable than somebody like you. And we talked about that a little bit, and we've had a few days, maybe about a week, since that last conversation. Where's your head around that now? Are you still pretty zen about the whole thing, about the sort of the contrast?
Yeah, I think it's fine. I expected actually a little bit more flack because I think everybody has their home ground, their belief system, that their structure that they operate out of. And I think, as you know, in the work that you do, that if there's something that's not supporting that belief system, it tends to aggravate and threaten people. Mm-hmm. And so people had ideas of the Vietnam War. They had ideas about viewing the pot-smoking guys as degenerates or whatever. And that's fine with me. I think the thing is that some people will get it and some people won't. And so insofar as the relatively harsh critiques that I've created there, or there have been a response, that's expected and that's okay.
Yeah.
Because I am not them. They're totally entitled to their opinion.
Yeah. One of the things that really blows my mind about your book is the amount of dialogue and the detail, the attention to detail about what was said. I'm just curious about that process and how much of that you have from memory, notes. How did you resurrect these really intense conversations about, going through a river or crossing a river and being told to do it and knowing that it was an absolutely ridiculous thing to do, but yet there's this, really detailed exchange going on between you and sometimes 2-3 other people. How did you preserve those conversations and then bring them forward into this book? It's kind of an amazing sort of transference, actually.
Well, I think to say that I was able to take notes like a stenographer and or a court reporter, and with absolute precision recount what was said during these exchanges it's just not possible. But when I reviewed the whole experience in 1978, what I did was I took a sequence of events, and in the book it's just like a string of beads. It's this event, then that event, and then that event, and I wrote them down. Mm-hmm. And to the degree to which in 78 I could recall what was going on at that particular time. And some of the dialogue, it's burned into my memory forever. Yeah. And most of it is I would say probably about 80% accurate. Some of it is the gist of what was said, but it was like when I first got into platoon, and Sergeant Ski comes out of a bunker and he starts quizzing me about did I ever smoke marijuana, and then this very imposing black guy comes out of the bunker in the darkness and says, "Hey, Ski, give the man a bomber." I mean, that's burned into my mind forever.
It seems to me that you're almost like a living cipher of Chris Taylor, who, of course, is the character that's played by Charlie Sheen in Joker in Full Metal Jacket, the Matthew Modine character. There's an interesting kind of combination because Chris Taylor is always taking notes, right? Because he's a writer, and that's Oliver Stone, obviously. And then of course there's Joker, who's a photographer, and you've got the pictures here. You've got tons of pictures, and you managed to keep those. It was almost like, to me, in some ways, you're operating on multiple levels of consciousness. Like there was a future you that was invested in the present you. And you may or may not have been aware of that, but that's my sense here because of the attention to detail and the collection of images and the sort of layered and advanced understanding about what you were going through. Have you ever, kind of meditated on this in terms of like past, present, future, time, relationship to future self? Any of these kinds of questions around identity?
Yeah, one of the things that when I was a kid in the neighborhood, I was pretty young in like when I was in like kindergarten and through grade school. The neighbors' fathers had come back from World War II. And I looked at these guys, and as a kid I thought, they're not telling me something. They're not expressing something. They're holding secrets. I don't know what's going on in their mind, but I sensed that they had gone through some changes, and for some reason or another, they weren't allowed to really share and express what their perceptions and experiences had been during the war. And I think insofar as my original comment about there being 2 ways to silence a guy and 1 way to make him a hero, I think the guys who were aghast at the brutality of it were silenced that way. Mm-hmm. But I did sense in my neighbors' dads that whatever they were holding on to, whatever they weren't telling, was not in their best interest. It was hurting them. They were investing a lot of energy in keeping the lid on it. And so I thought, even as a young child, I thought, if I ever go to war, I'm going to share that experience, because there's something intrinsically not right about having a geopolitical form of diplomacy translated into brutality and have the people back home not understand that was the case. Mm-hmm. So that thought wasn't fully formed as a kid, but I knew that there was something that was being withheld from the World War II vets. And I have friends whose dads were in World War II. A lot of them never talked about it.
Yeah.
And the thing is that those people that I just talk about these kind of things with now have been in the atmosphere of the repressed memories of their parents. And even though they weren't discussed, the emotional atmosphere was permeating their home. And the younger people were picking up on it and didn't know what to do with it. So Dad didn't have to say that, I went up in there with these young German kids that were tossing hand grenades at us and I had to kill them, right?
Right.
But from Dad's emotionality and from, you see him struggling to maintain the stoic John Wayne type of strong, silent type image.
Yeah.
You could feel that there was something there that was left unsaid and that was painful.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we've had, let's see, 1, 2, about 3.5, maybe almost 4 generations since World War II. Not sure so much about North Korea, the Korean War. That was a really weird war. Very strange.
Yeah.
In fact, you had a vet, a Korean War vet in your platoon.
Yeah.
As well. What was that like for him to go from Korea, which was this very odd war, almost a non-war to some extent, to being in Nam? What was that like for him?
I don't know. I didn't discuss it with him. He was our platoon leader.
Yep.
He's in the bottom left on that montage.
Yep.
But he was a guy who was like a soldier. And he understood who he was dealing with insofar as us draftees were concerned.
Right.
And he was looking out for us. And he took his job seriously, but yet he wasn't about to expose us to any unnecessary insanity and danger of some strategies or tactics that might be issued from the rear. So he was way cool, but I don't know how his Korean experience influenced him. There was a lot of stuff that we didn't sit down and discuss a lot of things because there really wasn't a lot of time. And he was of another rank, so there was an automatic kind of barrier there to communication.
So this is Sergeant McCoy, the real McCoy.
Yeah.
And wasn't he missing part of a lung or something like that?
One time we were on a hilltop, and we had been struggling up this hill all day. And at the end of the day, he took off his shirt and he put both of his hands in the air, and he says, "That's another blankety blank. I'm never going to have to climb again." And one of the guys in the platoon pointed out a big scar on his back, and he says, "See that? That was a chunk of his lung he lost in Korea." And so, I mean, the man moves on. I was grateful that he was our platoon leader, and the whole thing with lifers and not lifers, it wasn't black and white. There were career people who were really good, who understood that we were in a bind, and the best way that to deal with the situation was to be as competent as we possibly could under the conditions and go home. And I think he was from that school.
Yeah.
There were other people who saw the war as an opportunity to increase their rank in that system, and had less concern for the welfare of the guys that they were leading.
And ultimately, you saw the war as something quite different from a number of other people. You saw the war ultimately as a point of transcendence and transformation. And that's the part I want to talk about. And we were only supposed to go for an hour. We're an hour into this thing now, so I want to take your temperature, Perry. How are you doing? Are you pressed for time? Do you need to?
No, I'm fine.
Okay.
I'm fine.
Well, why don't we do this? Let's play some more music. And this is another track that really is indicative of the times. And when we come back on the other side, we'll talk more with Perry. We'll talk about his spiritual transformation, both during and after the Vietnam War, and kind of where it's leading now. So here's a song for the times. It's the Rolling Stones. Give Me Shelter. Of course, that was the Rolling Stones. Give Me Shelter. And Give Me Shelter and Altamont generally considered the end of the 1960s, the end of the Summer of Love, and the ushering in of a darker era in the early 70s. Oh. Yes, we can hear you knocking, but you can't come in, not right now. So the Summer of Love was winding down in 1969, 1970, Altamont, and a new reality was setting in. People were coming home from the war, and they were coming home to a very disaffected and at times even aggressive population that viewed them not as heroes, but more along the lines of scapegoats, as Perry was talking about. And we're going to check back in here with Perry Ulander. And I want to read a piece here, Perry, that kind of may be a catalyst here to talk about some of the content that really transformed your life. And it comes from the back of the book, and it says here that ultimately he, that means you, describes the surrender of social norms and accepted identities that allows him to glimpse a previously unimagined realm of heightened awareness. And you and I, again, talked about some of this stuff when we were kind of debriefing our interview with one another, or today, that we're going to talk about today. And you talked about some really incredible things. One piece of phenomena was this story about this guy that was, essentially running down an NVA and went into the NVA's body. He left his body, went into the NVA's body, felt what that was like, came back into his body, and then was completely shattered from that point forward. And I've heard other stories that were going on at that time where there was this phenomenon that was happening. It was absolutely mind-blowing. I knew a guy up in Seattle, I think his name was Dale, and he became a shaman. I mean, he was flying helicopters, and he was the air vac. He was getting guys out. And he told me this story. He said he flew his helicopter, brought it down, and there were some guys on the ground. It was an ambush, and one of the guys was still alive, and they were going to pick him up. And then all of a sudden, the NVA came out and started firing point blank at this helicopter. And the way he described the story to me was the guy couldn't have been more than 5 feet away from him. And for all intents and purposes, he should not have missed, but there was not one bullet in the helicopter, not one bullet in the windshield. But he couldn't wait around at that point for another quote-unquote miracle to happen. And he had to lift off, and in his mind, the face of the guy on the ground looking at him through the window of the helicopter seared a memory onto his brain he was never able to forget. And that changed his life, and eventually that catalyzed him towards this deep shamanic work. So there's this field of phenomenon that's happening there. And this is where I kind of want to go with you, and how you begin to shift, you begin to change, and your perspective becomes more and more transcendent, and the war itself becomes an initiation for you into a higher form of consciousness.
Yeah, well, if when I reflect on it, there were a couple very critical atmospherics that were catalysts for change. And one is we carried a monstrous pack. Like the radio that I carried weighed 28 pounds, which is just ridiculous. The extra battery was 3 pounds. We carried between 8 and 10 quarts of water, which is 20 pounds. Then a bunch of grenades, a poncho liner, entrenching tool, claymore mine. I mean, it was just absolutely brutal. And so in order to accommodate, somehow mentally adjust to the fact that this was a real struggle just to carry that much weight, you adjust your mind to, you play with it, and you realize a couple of things. One is if you start feeling sorry for yourself and you start considering, oh my God, this is brutal, I'll never make it through the day, poor me and stuff, the pack gets heavier. But if you take a breath and focus on the trail in front of you, and I used to do that as a exercise. I thought it had some survival value. I would look up 20, 30 meters and ahead of me on the trail. I would look to my left, I would look to my right, and I would look in the trees for snipers. And then do that over and over again, because I thought, here is my chance. I'm not going to get a second chance. And if I miss a clue, it might be my last time to miss a clue. Mm-hmm. So as I was doing that, I realized that there were little stretches of time when I wasn't aware that the pack was a challenge. And it would be like for maybe 3 minutes, and then I'd snap back and go, oh God, my shoulders hurt or whatever. But along with that, I was watching what we would refer to as the old timers carry the pack, and they carried it as if it was nothing. So I thought I can do that. Sooner or later I can do that. And what I found the cause and effect of being able to do that was to stay in the present and focus on what was in front of me. So that was one of the means through which a present-centered mindset was enforced. Mm-hmm. Because as soon as you wandered from that, physically it was painful. And along with that was the thought and the reality that you might not be here tomorrow. And that's very liberating in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. Because to whatever level we're conditioned and we're in whatever sense being politically correct, the force of that and the power of that is that somehow by hiding who you are, that will allow you to kind of glide through the day and get in another day, and you won't make any ripples, et cetera, et cetera. But when you think that today might be your last and the people you're with are open and trustworthy, it kind of opens some internal doors to allow you to express yourself more fully than you had before, mm-hmm. without fear of condemnation. So over time, between those two catalysts for change, the present-centered focus and the awareness of the imminence of being wasted at any particular moment in time, what I experienced in retrospect was the conditioning starts to fall off. And even though I had started out as a socially conditioned person of the 50s, mm-hmm. and then was mortified by the military, then reconditioned by the military, excuse me, and now I'm in another modality that neither of those identities would serve me well. And right. So I'm observing the other guys around me and also internally reflecting on the relationship between my mindset and my experience. And as I saw that was easing, kind of greasing the wheels, was making my life easier and less painful, the conditioning that I didn't realize had soaked in and become internalized on a very deep level was starting to dissolve. So I was becoming deconditioned continually as long as we were on the move in the jungle.
Uh-huh.
And then what I also experienced is when we would go to the rear and I would have time to think, a kind of confusion would set in. And I would almost couldn't wait to go back in the field so that I would be forced to maintain that present-centered focus.
Yeah. Interesting. Really interesting. Now, one could make a case that due to the fact that you were in such a highly charged, such a sensitive in terms of your relationship with the other guys around you, all that, all those factors that are playing into that moment, that it would be you're probably your only kind of through line in that moment in time. You could maintain that presence, maintain that focus, and everything else falls away, and be clearly in the now. How does that translate, or how did that translate for you after the war, coming back and dealing with some of the strangeness that America had kind of mutated into while you were gone? So how did that play out for you when you came home? Were you able to sustain that and continue to cultivate that, and to what extent were you able to do that?
Coming home was incredibly confusing, because after a point with maintaining that present-centered focus in the jungle, living in an organic environment, and by military procedures and policies, when you're in the jungle, you get up before dawn, and everybody's on watch before dawn, because there's that well-known factor that in the transition between darkness and light, your eyes have a hard time adjusting. And in that twilight zone, it's difficult for you to see things. So everybody was on guard in the morning and at night. And at that time, it was like, particularly if we'd lost a few guys, and the shadows are turning into colors and the clouds are drifting by, it's just amazing. It's amazing. You're just sitting there in awe of the natural beauty, and can open all your perceptual faculties to as wide as they possibly can, and be nurtured and nourished by your environment. And so you're used to being wide open, and to some degree on a psychic level. So you get off the plane in O'Hare, and you see people bustling around in what previously had been a normal situation. And you look at people interacting, and in spite of the fact that they seem to be play acting a role, and underneath that role are the lives of quiet desperation,
mm-hmm.
and anxiety and fear and depression. And I had a clear sense, and it's really hard to be objective about it, but a clear sense that this was the norm now. To present a persona that was in conflict with who you really were, in order to survive, and then the penalty or the natural outcome of that was to feel alienated from who you really were.
Interesting. So this is really kind of an X-ray moment for you, and I would assume shocking on some level.
Oh, yeah, it was stunning. It was stunning. And so then it was like, well, what's happening here? Am I delusional? Am I picking up on signals that aren't valid? And so I went back to my hometown, and shortly thereafter, there was a friend of mine who's still a dear friend, and we were roommates. And he had gotten drafted about the same time, just a little bit earlier than me. And he wanted to be a mechanic on a helicopter. But he didn't realize that the helicopter that he was a mechanic on was called a Loach. It's a light reconnaissance helicopter, a real dinky little thing. And it was its tactic to buzz around ridge lines and mountains and see if he could draw fire And then if his little helicopter drew fire, then we knew where they were. And we were kind of doing that on the ground too. Same absurd tactic, you know. If they shoot at us, we know where they're at. And then what he would do was he would call in Cobras, which are more heavily armored gunships, on that site. He would drop a red smoke grenade to identify where the site was. If he didn't decide to engage it, then they would bring in the Cobras or the Phantom jets, depending on what they thought was in the hills. But at any rate, we were roommates, and I've contacted him since, and we're in continual contact, and we marvel at the fact that when we were roommates, neither one of us said anything about our respective roles and experiences in Vietnam.
Mm.
We had been so stunned by the atmospheric of that we don't want to hear it, right? That on an intuitive level, we clammed up. We wouldn't talk about it. And some guys are there to this day, which is tragic because I think the social cultural matrix needs to know, right? Yeah. So,
well, really, especially now, it feels like the wheels are really turning towards some kind of larger conflagration. I think we're all instinctual. We all kind of sense there's something in the air, right? Maybe it's maybe it's some kind of false flaggery. Maybe it's hordes of MS-13 and highly trained social Marxist Cubans flowing through the border. Maybe it's the Russians. Who knows? Maybe it's what's happening in the South China Seas now with the U.S. and China, and the U.S. doing this little war game dance over there. So this kind of dialogue, this kind of inquiry, I think, is really vital because we're living in such a cognitively dissonant era and phase. We've had this war going on since 2002. And it's really bizarre because nobody really thinks that there's a war going on. It's one of the strangest things. We've got people coming home all the time. They're taking their lives. They're going through similar horrors, but I'm sure way different than what you guys went through. And yet, it's like it's not even really happening. It's utterly bizarre.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I've been dumbfounded about it since we went into Iraq. And I was working with a group of guys in construction, and a lot of them were hooked into the macho thing about it, and it did nothing chaps my hide like people saying, and we are going to go over, and we are going to do this, and we are going to do that, as they go through their normal day of work-a-day world and go home to the wife and kids, while we are over there, liberating Iraq from this tyrant or whatever the party line was.
Right.
And that one goes on and on. So also in regards to the fact that I think everybody is on some level sensing that there's some big change going on. There's so many things that are teetering on the brink. The economy, the geopolitical scenario, and on that list goes. I was talking to that same friend of mine that I was telling you about who was a door gunner on a helicopter just the other day. And he said, isn't it great that when we were kids, we were in Vietnam? And he had a rough road, both there and coming home. And I said, yeah, I really appreciate that. Because we both realized through our respective experiences that the only safe haven was in your mind and in your belief system and in adjusting to what you identified with. And if you're hooked into the daily news, you feel like it's disempowered and there's nothing you can do but just watch the horror as it unfolds.
Mm-hmm.
But I think if you identify with like one of the things when I was overseas was, so I wasn't the socialized person that got drafted, and then I wasn't the one that the military tried to indoctrinate me into being. But there were times, particularly after you lost some people and you're sitting on a hilltop and you're watching the sun rise over an expanse of a valley and there's a river running through it, and you realize that's what I identify with. I'm part of this system, not this artifice that's gone mad.
Right.
And in that shift of identity, there's a very comfort there, because in this system, in the organic system, life goes on. And people are free to choose whichever way they want to go. And from my perspective, depending on however much pain they want to create for themselves. And so as it is geopolitically and on a global basis right now, it seems like people are backing themselves into a corner. And as horrifying as that might be, I think it's all but necessary for people to say, wait a minute, what in the heck are we doing here?
Mm-hmm.
So to me, on one level it's horrifying, and on another level it's inevitable and has to be that way, because you can't maintain the status quo on the trajectory we're at and deny the insanity of our foreign policy and expect to have a good outcome. It just isn't going to happen. In fact, the trajectory moves on, and the insanity increases to an absurd level. And I think I think probably, and I think you and I are concurrent on that, the potential for an economic shock, I think, is going to get people's attention.
Yeah.
And subsequent to that, who knows, what could happen. But I think the illusion of everything's hunky-dunky in the economy is one that people are slowly questioning. Is this valid? Is the stock market really reflecting value?
Right.
And is unemployment really 5% or whatever the figures are?
Right.
So
20% really, according to Donald Trump. And speaking of Trump, he claims to be very involved in the lives of veterans and very engaged, compassionate, sympathetic. What's your take on that? Is there any validity to that, or is that just more political rhetoric?
I don't know. I'm suspect about all politicians. It seemed like I used to discuss politics with a guy at work, and he would take the right-wing position, and I would take the left-wing position, right, just for sport. And we would go down the various areas of the bullet points of discussion where we would, be at extreme polarity with each other. Mm-hmm. And when he'd start to get red in the face, I would say, it seems to me like the right-wing people have a rhetoric that appeals to the right-wing conservative type of people, and the left have the same rhetoric directed at them. Mm-hmm. Then when either one of them gets elected, the agenda moves on, and the agenda is not determined by the person in office.
Right.
And he would look at me with kind of a big question mark over his head, and it was like I was speaking some kind of blasphemy, like I was supposed to be attached to one of the poles or another.
Right.
And, for instance, Obama had this tremendous way of connecting with the sentiment of the people at the time prior to his election. I mean, he was really emotionally moving people and speaking to their concerns and their frustration.
Right.
And then when he gets elected, he's out bushing Bush. And so insofar as the Trump thing, I think it's kind of interesting that apparently he's rattling some cages. But I'm wondering if he isn't the right-wing version of Obama, and that if he gets elected, the agenda will still move on.
That's right.
That's right. So I find it amusing on some level, but excuse me, I can't hang my hat on either camp, because I think it's a charade.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you had any insight from the veteran side of things about his, relationship with them in a very kind of honest and committed way, because he's, always championing, what's going on with them and wants to do things differently for them. And if that's the case, I think it's great. I think it's even better, that we really examine our policy around these foreign conflicts, which are really just, doing business for banks and corporations, boots on the ground for banks and corporations, the redistribution of borders and bank accounts and resources.
Right.
It's all it's ever been, really, to be honest with you, right?
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
And that's a travesty, especially in the light of something along the lines of Memorial Day, and you and I, again, talked a little bit about this. And I in our exchange, was like sensitive, like, what is this to Perry? How does Memorial Day impact somebody like him? And, you had a really great response. You rode your bicycle into town and got an ice cream cone. But it's this whole kind of notion and the celebration of, thanks for serving and, all these sentiments. And while I understand that people want to be compassionate, conscious, hold a space for these people that are supposedly upholding our freedoms, in many cases they're also participating in a very deep lie, even though they're earnest in their appreciation. And to me, this is one of the biggest conundrums that we have to kind of talk about deconditioning. I mean, this is a big one. You have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, one of the things that has kind of become popular in the last maybe 4 or 5 years is for people, when they discover you're a vet, and for most vets, it's been our dirty secret for most of our lives that you don't wear it on your sleeve, that's for sure. And so when people would thank me for my service, right, I get this kind of big question mark over my head. I mean, it's like, so from my mind, I wasn't participating in spreading freedom and democracy, and I wasn't participating in enhancing the image of the United States. I was in this confused situation that I don't think did either of the above, and created a lot of havoc and a lot of suffering for a lot of people. For what end, I'm still puzzling, but it wasn't the cover story that we were told. I know that for certain. So when people say thanks for your service, I appreciate the sentiment, but it kind of throws me in a place of, to some degree, confusion, because I don't think I should be thanked for what I did.
Mm-hmm.
It was like, and so what do you say? Well, I was a dumb kid and believed in people and systems that I should have known better, and wound up in a place that was alien to me, and doing something for somebody that I didn't understand and still don't understand. Thanks for your service. I appreciate the sentiment, but it's confusing.
It is confusing, and yet it almost feels like it's one of those kind of social customs that people, sort of self-police them, and adopt. Like, if you don't do it, you're not really supporting the machine, or it's one of these weird things, and it creates this kind of complicit nature with these conflicts, whatever they are, whether it's a coup in Guatemala, or some heavy thing going down somewhere in the Middle East or North Africa. I mean, the kind of, it's I don't know. It just adds to this complicit nature. It's well-meaning, but it's really unconscious on some level. It's like, in some ways, the highest form of unconsciousness, because they believe that they're actually being conscious, or having a conscious moment, in that, hey, thank you, being very earnest, and yet it's completely, flipped in the other direction, if you ask me. So it's a very strange kind of mental state. And I think it's one of the mental states that, keeps us in this generalized fog, and not just about war, but in general. It's a very strange kind of sentiment. And I know that for somebody like yourself, it only gets kind of more unusual when they really drill down and get real with it. One of the things that you and I talked about was you reading an excerpt from the book, and you've got such a great voice. It even comes across better on radio and your home line, by the way, than our Skype session. It's very rich and resonant. And I'd love it if you could take one of those passages that you've written and give us a little taste of that in the first person.
Okay. Just as a little background to this particular passage, excuse me, there was a guy, Captain Speed, who I was introduced to. He was our point man. He was in his second tour. He was, even from my brief introduction to people in the field, everybody was pretty much in awe and had a great deal of regard for Captain Speed. So I'm in the jungle. It was my first night in the jungle, and somebody handed me a watch, and it's pitch dark, and I had an hour and a half to be on guard for the rest of the squad. So I sensed that there was somebody behind me, and part of my reference was, you can't do that. You can't sense that somebody's behind me. And so I turned, and there was a guy standing there like a cigar store Indian. And it was Captain Speed, and he was standing there waiting to see if I could sense him. And as I sensed him, he floated up and squatted down next to me, and then there's this passage here. Speed allowed me to indulge in the experience for quite some time. This is after he'd fired up a bomber. He seemed very loose and relaxed. From the corner of my eye, I could see he was smiling. There was something about the old-timers that was beyond my understanding. They were comfortable being whoever they were. Tennessee with his giggly maternal concern, Creeper with his blunt directness, and Sergeant Ski with his childlike innocence. But they all said sort of a warmth and kindness beneath the surface, and they all, like Speed, found it easy to smile. Speed leaned closer and asked, "Did anyone tell you about these poncho liners?" And just as an aside, by this time I'm getting pretty high. "What do you mean? I would have thought that there wasn't much to say about them." They were well suited for the jungle, 2 layers of finely woven nylon with a half-inch of Dacron insulation quilted inside, printed with camouflage blotches of various shades of green and brown. "Well," he continued with a grin, "most people don't know this, but these poncho liners are bug-proof, snake-proof, and bulletproof. I've never heard of anyone being killed at night while wrapped in one." It was hard for me not to laugh out loud. It was such a ridiculous thing to say. But having been anxious to ask one of the old-timers for hints on how to survive, I realized that here was the most experienced man in the country, sacrificing his own much-needed sleep to give me a clue. Excuse me. His words sank into my being like pennies into a lake, sinking slowly till they hit bottom. Something inside me knew that even though, at face value, what he said wasn't true, I should take it as being true, completely, without reservation. What Speed was saying was that here in the Central Highland, in Charles's land, there were 2 ways to retire at night. You could be anxious and fearful about your throat being slit or a mortar round landing on your head, or you could retreat into the warm womb of your magic poncho liner and feel secure that you get a deep, revitalizing night's sleep. Speed was watching me carefully, and somehow he saw that I got what he was trying to say. He nodded, doubled his poncho liner over his head, and lit a cigarette, demonstrating how it was done in the field at night. Then he offered me a glowing end in his cupped hands. I pulled a soggy Camel from my pocket and took the light, realizing that I had been incredibly tense all day. Now, though, sitting with Speed in the humid cool of the night, something in me relaxed and something smiled. And that's the way guys were.
Yeah.
Each in their own way.
Wow. the detail in the language is wonderful stuff. And I know that you are not you haven't done a lot of public sort of reading with the book, but I hope you have more opportunities to do this. It's a great book, and it's a great story, and I think it's just the beginning for you with what's going on with the book and some of the other things that we talked about. And I hope that this is one of many radio interviews that you're going to be able to get to do here, Perry, and share more excerpts and even share more publicly, not just on radio with folks, because we're at a time now where this story is important. We're at a time when it's not just right. It's not just ISIS, or it's not just the looming threat out there. It's in here, inside of the boundaries and the borders, however permanent they are, of this country. And the people that occupy this country, and the whole notion of conflict, and the whole notion of programming and identity. It's all in there. And it's a big dialogue that we got to have. The last 3 or 4 years with Obama, it's been all about division and divide and conquer. It's been terrible, and it's been awful. And about a year and a half ago, when all the Freddie Gray stuff and the Mike Brown stuff and the Trayvon Martin stuff was happening, it felt like, Black America was being weaponized. It was really a very intense time. And I had a lot of, really close friendships and bonds with people like on Facebook and other places that were being threatened by this hyper-socialized sort of propaganda. And so here we are again. It's all about the programming. It's all about the deconstruction. It's all about the identity and who we're identifying with and against. And, so your book and, hopefully can even, shed some light in that area of our lives. It's not just the big picture of the boogeyman out there. It's also how we deal with each other on a day-to-day basis right here in this place.
Yeah, and one of the things that has been part of my process since I got back from Vietnam is the kind of sense of being dumbfounded at the slow uptake of the general public into questioning authority and the mainstream media. Mm-hmm. And for a long time, it was a sense of aggravation. And I think, how can people not understand that they're being manipulated? How can this possibly be? And subsequently, when I looked at it more closely, it seems to me that this is a very sophisticated and well-implemented psyops. The propaganda, the fear-mongering, the sequences of events, real or imagined, or colored in a way that just keeps fear right on the edge of becoming manifest in your house, right?
That's right. Absolutely.
Which makes people very malleable and susceptible to whatever the party line and the story of the day is. And so as I became more and more aware of what a sophisticated manipulation that has been ongoing for some years, I felt more compassion for the general public than frustration. Mm-hmm. Because it's a situation where eventually things are going to right themselves. Eventually the truth will be known. Mm-hmm. And the longer the delay between the light bulb going on and the darkness is a place of where I think there's going to be increasing suffering.
Yeah.
And so I view the general populace with much more compassion than the previous modality of anger and frustration and just bewilderment of how could this possibly be.
You brought up an interesting question about questioning reality. How come or questioning authority? How come more people don't question authority? What I find fascinating is that in the 60s and to some extent the 70s, it was a position that was promulgated. Like if you didn't question authority during the 60s and the 70s, you weren't alive. It was part of the coming of age in America, was questioning authority.
Right.
And I think what happened is that those people during the 60s and the 70s who questioned authority became the authority. And at that point, they decided to switch the program and decided to dumb down people about questioning authority, because now they were the ones who would have to have the inquisition, or they would have to have some kind of scrutiny. So I think the program, the PSYOP, really kicked in at that point. That's my sense.
Yeah, that could have been the timing, and I think the thing is that it's permeated the social matrix and the mindset of the general public so completely, it's invisible.
Yeah.
It's hard to determine what when the boundaries were set up, but people intuitively feel that it's kind of like the invisible dog fence, right?
Yeah.
They go in, they cross the boundary, and they get shocked by their collar a couple times, and then on an intuitive level, they don't go near the boundary anymore.
Right. It's a great analogy.
So I think the boundary is losing its charge. It's kind of like when you turn the power off to the electric dog fence. Yeah. And some people realize, hey, you can step over this. It's not empowered anymore.
Yeah.
I think that's where we're at, and I think there is basically I would consider myself to be irrationally optimistic in that if you look at the news and the media and the supposed objective perception of what's going on today, it looked like a nightmare.
Right.
But I think something else is brewing underneath that. Something else is trying to emerge through the chaos that potentially could be beyond our wildest imaginings and lead us into a place of harmony and understanding.
Yep.
That right now seems like a pipe dream.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. And if there's anybody that has what we would call street cred into that kind of realization or vision, it would be you, because you've lived it. I mean, you've lived it. And you are, a living testament to something emerging out of a form of chaos. So, I think there's some gravitas and legitimacy around what you're saying, not just because you're saying it, but because you've actually lived it. And I also agree with that wholeheartedly. Listen, Perry, I hope you do more interviews. I hope you do more radio, because you're really clear. You're really lucid. You've got great takes. The fence analogy was great. I don't know if you've come up with that or you thought about that, but man, that was so spot on. And I just hope you get more opportunities to elucidate some of this stuff, because I really think that this is your next phase, your next platform is to bring more insight and clarity to kind of people's lives at large. And I just hope that this is the first of many radio opportunities and speaking opportunities for you, because you've done the work. You've done the work. It's clear. And we need people that have gone through polarization, deconstruction, fear. This is a life path that is emerging towards a very particular point in time. So keep going and keep getting on your phone and talking to people. I think this is going to be a good thing for you and us.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to be on your show and also the support that you've given all along the way. And actually, the catalyst to this book getting published was all because of your efforts and your insight and the connections that you had. And so I think part of the thing that's giving me a little bit of or significant support is that throughout this process, it seems like there's been a series of synchronistic events that have happened just in time, which gives me the sense that this is an appropriate thing to do.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like in my normal reference to my day-to-day experience. Sometimes when things are going smooth and easy and I'm relaxed and clear-minded, I take note. And other times when I step off the trail and I'm into the briars and brambles and not having a very pleasant experience, I take note of that too, and realize that either way is a function of my paying attention to my own internal guidance system, and maintenance of and taking responsibility for my state of mind. And so, at any rate, I appreciate this opportunity, and I also want to say that this whole process has been a stretch for me at every turn, but it seems like just in time, some support comes. Just in time where I'm wobbling in self-doubt or confusion or something, something happens, and here's a helping hand. It's been amazing to me. So I really am grateful for the fact that your initial reading that you did, a year and a half ago, really set the tone and kind of enforced a vaguely intuitive sense in me that what I've documented in this book might be of value to other people, and that this might be the time.
Yep. Well, it is the time, and our time here is almost up. We've got about 5 minutes left. So you and I will be in touch down the line, I'm sure, in probably not so distant future. But I really want to, again, thank you for coming on the air and, opening up and talking about some of this stuff and getting into the contents and, reading a few words for us. It was really great. And you just keep on walking the point, man, in this realm of the incarnation, and take good care of yourself. And, we'll see you somewhere down the line, I'm sure.
Okay. Well, thanks a bunch, Robert. I appreciate all you've done all the way along the line. And a lot of it is, not visible to most people until now.
Yeah. My pleasure, Perry. Absolutely.
Okay.
You take care now.
You too. Bye.
That was Perry Ulander, the author of Walking Point from the Ashes of the Vietnam War, a memoir. I highly recommend it. It's a great book, gives you some insight into the day-to-day life of somebody who just found themselves dropped in, for all intents and purposes, an acid trip, really. If you think about it, think about what he went through. Think about the modern equivalent of what that would be like for one of us, whatever that might be for you. And the thing about, me sort of getting involved with Perry and pass this on to Richard, look, we're in a place and time in our lives where we got to help people. This is where it's at. We are it, right? So whether it's me or you or somebody else, if there's the ability to help out another person and there's a venue or there's a, kind of a leg up, we got to do that. Because this is it. We are it. We are our support group, our tribe, our network. And it's time for us to, come out of the shadows, and be able to do whatever it is we can in the right moment, in the right time, in the right place with the right person. And if it's meant to work, it's going to work. And if it's not meant to work, then it's not. And this is an instance where it was supposed to happen. And I was absolutely thrilled that we could actually get on the air and talk about the book. All right. I'm going to try to be back on Sunday night and get into astrology. We got the Mars retrograde. I've got a new piece up on my site. We got the new moon in Gemini. I believe it's tomorrow, if I'm not mistaken. And this Mars retrograde is a whopper, an absolute whopper. And I'm going to talk more about that on Sunday night. Again, if you haven't been to my website, I've got a pre-sale going on for the 11th House Academy. It looks like it's going to be around a 13-hour course in astrology with video, narrative, lecture, lab, PDFs, and it's a really great price. Right now it's $295, and I say right now it's $295, and I think we've got 6 people that have pre-ordered, which means there's 27 spots left, and those are going to go away in 17 days. So what you're going to get for the pre-order is you're going to get the course, you'll get a natal chart, a natal report. Every month you're going to meet with me for 2 hours, and this is private. in a webinar setting, and you will also get a 30-minute reading from me. This is if you sign up, if you pre-order before the 20th. After the 20th, the half-hour reading goes away, and that's worth $88 because that's what I charge for a half-hour reading. So go to my website. It's all over my website right now. Check it out, 11th House Academy. Okay, you know the drill. Use your head to discern what's real, your heart to stay open to what's possible. Here's Elon Musk's favorite philosopher. Thank you, Eric Roth. Philip K. Dick. And as they say, you know the drill. I'll see you on Sunday night.
We are living in a computer-programmed reality, and the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed and some alteration in our reality occurs. We would have the overwhelming impression that we were reliving the present, déjà vu, perhaps in precisely the same way, hearing the same words, saying the same words. I submit that these impressions are valid and significant, and I will even say this: such an impression is a clue that at some past time point, a variable was changed, reprogrammed as it were, and that because of this, an alternative world branched off.